115 million years ago, the middle of Australia was underwater, not flooded, not a temporary inland lake, an ocean. Warm water stretched more than 1,600 kilometers, which is about 1,000 miles, across a continent that is now covered by desert. And somewhere beneath that ancient surface, something was hunting. It was a marine reptile with a skull longer than a pickup truck bed. Its name was Kronosaurus queenslandicus. Its teeth could reach 28 centimeters, which is about 11 inches, but they were not built like shark teeth. They were thick, conical spikes designed to grip and hold. Its estimated bite force reached 30,000 newtons. The animal behind it was not a dinosaur. It breathed air at the surface. It gave birth to live young, and it ruled an ocean that covered much of what is now Queensland. But the strangest part of its story is not the animal itself, it is what happened after it died. The most famous Kronosaurus skeleton in the world sits in a Harvard museum and has been seen by millions of people. But much of that skeleton is plaster. Scientists have nicknamed it Plasterosaurus. Some of the bones assembled into that enormous mount may not have belonged to Kronosaurus at all, which means the image most people have of this animal may be wrong. And if that skeleton is wrong, what did the real predator actually look like? What did it hunt? How did it kill? And what can the bones of its actual prey still tell us about an animal that disappeared more than 100 million years ago? Tonight, we're going back beneath the vanished Eromanga Sea to uncover what Kronosaurus really was, how it hunted, what its fossilized victims reveal, and why one of the most famous sea monster skeletons ever displayed may be partly a scientific reconstruction that never truly existed. The world that produced Kronosaurus was already changing long before its bones entered the rocks of Queensland. During the early Cretaceous, between 145 and 100 million years ago, the continents occupied different positions. The atmosphere contained more carbon dioxide, and global seas stood much higher than they do today. Vast portions of continents disappeared beneath shallow water, creating environments that had no modern equivalent. Australia itself lay farther south, closer to Antarctica than its present position. Yet latitude did not produce the cold landscape we might expect. A warmer global climate carried temperate conditions into regions that today would experience much harsher seasons, allowing marine ecosystems to flourish across the southern continent. The combination of geography and climate created an unusual setting, one in which shallow seas could persist across enormous areas while remaining productive enough to support animals measured in tons. The inland waterway that mattered most was the Eromanga Sea. It was an epicontinental sea, meaning ocean water had advanced across the continental interior rather than occupying a basin separated from land. At its greatest extent, it covered roughly 60% of present day Queensland and reached southward into South Australia. Its waters divided Australia into broad eastern and western landmasses, turning regions that are now dry interior country into coastlines, islands, and seafloor. Much of this sea was shallow, generally around 46 to 198 meters, about 150 to 650 feet deep. Sunlight could therefore penetrate through substantial portions of the water column, reaching communities of microscopic organisms that formed the foundation of an elaborate food web. Nutrients circulated through the shallow environment, supporting dense populations of fish and invertebrates, which in turn sustained larger hunters. Among those hunters were ichthyosaurs, streamlined marine reptiles shaped for rapid movement, and elasmosaurids, whose extraordinary necks gave them an entirely different way of searching the water. Large sea turtles moved through the same environment, while ammonites coiled through the currents and cephalopods occupied another branch of the food web. Sharks added another layer of predation. None of these animals needed to resemble modern ocean life exactly for the ecosystem to function. Each occupied a particular place within it, shaped by millions of years of evolutionary experimentation. The reptiles dominating these waters belonged to lineages that had entered the ocean long before Kronosaurus appeared. Pliosaurs were part of the larger plesiosaur family, but their bodies followed a very different design from their long-necked relatives. Their necks became shorter, their skulls became larger, and their torsos remained compact and muscular. Four broad flippers provided propulsion, turning the entire body into a powerful underwater platform. That body plan had deep roots. Marine reptiles had been adapting to life in the ocean since the Triassic, more than 200 million years ago, passing through changing climates, shifting coastlines, and repeated ecological upheavals. Pliosaurs inherited that long experiment and refined it toward pursuit and predation, concentrating much of their physical power toward the front of the body. Kronosaurus queenslandicus emerged from this lineage in Australia, formally named in 1924 by the paleontologist Albert Heber Longman. The genus name came from Cronus, the titan of Greek mythology, associated with devouring his own children, a fitting reference to an animal whose existence would later become inseparable from the idea of immense predatory power. But the name came much later than the animal itself. By the time Longman studied its fossil remains, the sea that had supported this lineage was already part of Earth's deep geological past. The climate, geography, and evolutionary history had briefly aligned to create a habitat where an enormous pliosaur could thrive. Kronosaurus was the product of that alignment, shaped not by one extraordinary moment, but by an ocean, a continent, and millions of years of biological change. The first thing to understand about Kronosaurus is not its teeth, but the space occupied by its head. In the largest known individuals, the animal reached roughly 10 to 11 meters, about 33 to 36 feet, from snout to tail, with an estimated mass of around 10 to 12 metric tons, about 11 to 13 United States customary tons. Yet a skull measuring about 2.2 meters, roughly 7 feet, could occupy nearly a quarter of that entire length. The lower jaw extended to approximately 2.7 meters, about 9 feet, creating a front-heavy anatomy unlike almost anything else in the marine reptile world. That proportion changed the way the entire animal had to function. A skull this massive was not simply carried at the front of the body. Its weight shifted the center of mass forward, requiring the torso and flippers behind it to provide stability and control. Every movement through the water therefore began with an unusual arrangement, a powerful body organized around an enormous head, rather than a head balanced upon an otherwise conventional swimmer. The jaw itself became more specialized as it moved from front to back. Kronosaurus had a nisodont dentition, meaning the teeth differed substantially in size, shape, and spacing along the jaws. The largest teeth occupied the front of the mouth, where several pairs of elongated conical teeth projected outward from the snout. Some reached about 28 centimeters, roughly 11 inches in length. Their shape was important. They were not edged for cutting flesh into thin pieces. Their rounded surfaces concentrated pressure into narrow points, allowing them to penetrate and hold. Farther toward the rear, the teeth became shorter, more rounded, and more closely arranged. This change created two functional zones within the same mouth. The front favored secure penetration and retention, while the rear provided greater mechanical advantage as the jaws closed. Hard material encountered farther back could therefore be subjected to considerably greater compression, Shell, bone, and other resistant structures occupied a different mechanical problem from soft tissue, and the arrangement of the teeth reflects that distinction. At the very front of the snout, Kronosaurus carried four pairs of premaxillary teeth. Their position produced an interlocking pattern that concentrated gripping structures around the tip of the jaws. When the mouth closed, these teeth did not form a smooth cutting edge. They created a set of penetrating points distributed through a compact region, giving the animal several opportunities to secure prey during the first instant of contact. Running along the upper surface of the snout was another important feature, a strong ridge of bone positioned along the midline. It added structural reinforcement to a region that would experience substantial bending forces whenever the jaws closed around struggling prey. The skull therefore combined mass with internal support, concentrating material where mechanical stress could become greatest. The eye sockets added another dimension. They were large relative to the skull and positioned to provide broad visual coverage, with some potential overlap toward the front. That arrangement would have allowed the animal to bring its vision toward nearby targets, while the massive jaws occupied the leading edge of the body. Seen as a whole, the skull reveals an animal whose anatomy was governed by one central requirement: control of enormous force at close range. Bone, teeth, muscle attachment surfaces, and sensory openings were arranged around that task. Kronosaurus did not carry a large head by accident. Its entire body had been shaped to support one dominant structure, and that structure determined where strength was concentrated, how the animal balanced itself, and how its jaws met the living world. A number begins to emerge from the reconstructed jaws, but it is not simply a number on a scale. It is the result of rebuilding the skull inside a computer and asking how its bones would respond when the muscles closed the jaws with force. Paleontologists use finite element analysis, a technique borrowed from engineering, to divide a complex structure into countless small regions and calculate how stress moves through them under a simulated load. For Kronosaurus, this approach allows the fossil skull to become a mechanical model, revealing where force would have accumulated during a bite. The result changes depending on where the jaws meet, because force is never distributed evenly across a moving jaw. The farther a tooth sits from the joint, the more the geometry of the jaw influences the final output overall, while the muscle arrangement determines how much force can reach that point. The result at the front of the mouth falls between 15,000 and 22,000 newtons. Farther back, where the shorter teeth occupied the strongest mechanical position, the estimate rises to between 27,000 and 38,000 newtons. That difference is not a flaw in the calculation. A jaw behaves like a lever, and the position where force is applied matters enormously. The rear of the Kronosaurus jaw offered greater mechanical advantage, concentrating muscular power where resistant material could be crushed. That rear figure provides the more useful comparison with living animals. A large saltwater crocodile can generate approximately 16,000 newtons, making it the strongest biting reptile alive today. At its upper estimate, Kronosaurus produced more than twice that force. A human bite is tiny beside it, reaching roughly 300 newtons. The posterior bite of Kronosaurus therefore approached 100 times the force of a human bite, although the exact ratio depends on which estimates are compared. Then there is Tyrannosaurus rex, an animal separated from Kronosaurus by tens of millions of years, and an entirely different evolutionary history. Multiple biomechanical studies have estimated its bite between 35,000 and 57,000 newtons at a rear tooth. Those values remain the highest confirmed estimates for any known land animal. Yet the comparison becomes more interesting when the ranges are placed beside each other. Kronosaurus, at its upper posterior estimate of 38,000 newtons, enters the lower part of the Tyrannosaurus range. The resemblance did not come from shared ancestry or competition. The two predators never occupied the same habitat, and their skulls evolved under very different physical conditions. Tyrannosaurus possessed a deep skull and enormous jaw-closing muscles attached around the rear of the head, producing extraordinary compression through a relatively short, powerful snout. Kronosaurus reached comparable forces through a different arrangement, with an elongated jaw and its own system of muscular leverage. Their similarity is therefore a case of convergent evolution, where unrelated organisms independently arrive at comparable solutions to comparable biological problems. Large predators need to secure substantial prey, and doing that repeatedly places strict demands on bone, muscle, leverage, and tooth placement. Evolution can explore many forms, but physics narrows the possibilities. For Kronosaurus, the important point is not that one creature simply defeated another on an imaginary scale. Its estimated bite occupies a rare mechanical territory where the forces generated by a marine reptile approach those of the most powerful terrestrial predator known from the fossil record. The number becomes meaningful because it emerges from anatomy, and anatomy preserves the physical logic of an animal that spent its life turning muscle into force. A bite can be powerful without being gentle on the animal delivering it. When researchers model the Kronosaurus skull under feeding loads, the bone shows substantial strain, more than that recorded in a comparably sized crocodilian skull subjected to the same simulated force. The finding adds an important distinction to the mechanics of the animal. Its skull was not simply a rigid structure designed to produce the largest possible instant of pressure. It had to remain functional while prey resisted, twisted, and pulled in different directions. That matters because a struggling animal does not behave like a fixed object. When a turtle, plesiosaur, or large fish fought against a closed jaw, the forces could travel sideways through the skull, creating bending and twisting stresses that were very different from the straight compression of a simple bite. Kronosaurus appears to have occupied a compromise between enormous force and structural flexibility, allowing its jaws to maintain a grip while the rest of the animal continued moving through the water. Modern crocodiles possess another solution. They can clamp down and then rotate their bodies through the water, using a powerful twisting movement to tear pieces from large prey. This behavior depends on a skull and neck capable of handling substantial torsional loads. Kronosaurus does not show the same anatomical arrangement. Its elongated jaws and massive head were not suited to reproducing the characteristic crocodilian death roll. The absence of that mechanism suggests a different method of separating flesh from a living body. Its teeth provide the next clue. They lacked the fine serrations that turn a tooth into a cutting edge. Instead, their smooth, conical surfaces were shaped for penetration and retention. When those teeth entered tissue, their rounded geometry concentrated force into narrow points, allowing the jaws to hold prey rather than repeatedly slicing through it. The front of the mouth could establish the grip, while the stronger rear portion of the jaw brought greater compression to resistant material. Once attached, Kronosaurus may have used the mass of its entire body as part of the feeding mechanism. Rather than spinning like a crocodile, it could pull away from prey using muscular movement and the thrusting surfaces of its flippers to increase tension between the teeth and whatever remained in their grasp. This would turn the struggle itself into part of the feeding process, allowing tissue to separate through tension and tearing. The rear teeth also offered another capability, Their shorter, more rounded forms were positioned where the jaws could generate greater mechanical advantage, making them suitable for crushing resistant objects such as shell and bone. A sea turtle carapace, or an ammonite shell, presented a very different challenge from muscle, and the architecture of the rear jaw allowed Kronosaurus to apply force where those hard structures were most vulnerable. There is also evidence that some pliosaurs swallowed stones, known as gastroliths, which may have remained within the digestive tract and assisted with processing food. The exact function of these stones remains uncertain, but their presence fits an animal whose mouth was better adapted to securing and breaking large pieces than to finely chewing a meal. Fossilized stomach contents provide an even more direct glimpse. Kronosaurus specimens have preserved fragments of prey bone within their bodies, showing that pieces of food could enter the digestive system without being completely stripped of their skeletal material. The feeding system, therefore, extended beyond the instant of the bite. The jaws secured the prey, the body supplied additional force, and the digestive tract received substantial pieces that had already been reduced enough to swallow. The result was a predator whose feeding mechanics depended less on delicate processing than on maintaining control from first contact through consumption. Water leaves little room for wasted movement, and the body of Kronosaurus reflects that constraint. Four flippers transformed the animal into a swimmer driven by broad, controlled strokes rather than by a long tail beating from side to side. Each flipper moved through the water in a pattern based on lift, producing thrust during both phases of its stroke. The same general principle appears in penguins, sea turtles, and sea lions, although each lineage arrived at its own version independently. Instead of pushing against the water like a paddle, a flipper moving through a particular angle can generate pressure differences across its surface, producing lift and forward motion. This arrangement allows rapid changes in speed without requiring the animal to maintain a high cruising velocity for long periods. For a predator that needed to cross a short distance quickly, that distinction was valuable. The body did not need to become a marine racing machine. It needed to turn stored muscular power into sudden movement when an opportunity appeared. Kronosaurus had an unusual distribution of that power. Its rear flippers were longer and more robust than the front pair, a pattern that differs from the more front-heavy arrangement seen in many other large pliosaurs. The hind limbs, therefore, appear to have contributed substantially to acceleration, giving the animal a powerful drive from behind as the body moved toward a target. Taken together, the two rear flippers may have reached a span of approximately 5 meters, about 16 feet, from one tip to the other. That broad surface area provided a substantial interface with the surrounding water. Each stroke could redirect a large volume of water, allowing the animal to change its velocity while maintaining control of a body whose front end carried an extraordinary amount of mass. The neck played a role in this hydrodynamic arrangement as well. Unlike the long-necked plesiosaurs that shared its environment, Kronosaurus kept the distance between its torso and skull extremely short. The head therefore remained close to the leading edge of the body, reducing the amount of structure projecting into the water ahead of it. There was less elongated anatomy to move first, leaving the jaws positioned near the front of the animal's overall profile. A small tail fin has also been proposed from comparisons with related pliosaurs, although its presence in Kronosaurus itself remains uncertain. If such a structure existed, it would probably have served mainly as a stabilizing surface during changes in direction rather than as the primary source of propulsion. Most of the meaningful movement would still have come from the four large flippers. The rest of the body appears to have followed a relatively streamlined form, with a rounded, torpedo-like cross-section that reduced resistance as water passed around the torso. The enormous skull remained the major interruption to that smooth shape, but the animal's anatomy behind it appears to have been arranged to support efficient movement rather than simply to carry weight. There is no precise measurement for the maximum burst speed of Kronosaurus, so estimates remain comparisons rather than direct observations. Similar marine reptiles suggest that short bursts may have reached roughly 10 to 16 kilometers per hour, about 6 to 10 miles per hour. At that speed, even a brief acceleration could close a substantial gap before prey had enough time to change direction. The important feature was not speed alone. A moving Kronosaurus brought its entire body into the encounter. The flippers supplied acceleration, the streamlined torso carried that momentum forward, and the jaws waited at the leading edge. When the teeth met their target, the force of contact was therefore not produced by the mouth in isolation. It was supported by the movement of everything behind it, turning the animal's body into part of the mechanism of the strike. A living sea is never arranged in a single layer. Beneath its surface, different bodies occupy different depths, speeds, and ways of finding food, creating a moving architecture in which thousands of lives can overlap without competing for exactly the same things. The Eromanga Sea had this structure in abundance, and its largest inhabitants belong to several very different branches of marine reptile evolution. Among the fastest were ichthyosaurs, streamlined reptiles whose bodies resembled those of dolphins, with large eyes and vertical tail fins built for sustained movement. They could pursue fish through open water and descend into deeper parts of the sea, occupying a hunting space that differed from the slower, more maneuverable feeding patterns of long-necked plesiosaurs. Their streamlined forms show how strongly natural selection had shaped certain reptiles toward life in the water, even though they remained air-breathing animals. Near the upper waters lived elasmosaurids, including Eromangosaurus and related forms. Their elongated necks gave them a distinctive feeding strategy, allowing the head to reach into schools of fish while much of the body remained farther away. In some species, the neck exceeded the length of the torso, creating a body plan unlike anything alive today. Their long proportions also place them within a different ecological space from the large-headed pliosaurs moving through the same sea. Sea turtles added another form of marine specialization. At least 4 species are known from the Eromanga Sea, including animals that reached roughly 4 meters, about 13 feet, in length. Their shells provided substantial protection, but they were not invulnerable. Fossilized remains found within Kronosaurus specimens show that these heavily built reptiles could become food for the largest predator in the ecosystem. Sharks occupied another position in the hierarchy. Cretoxorhina, a large Cretaceous shark, reached approximately 6 meters, about 20 feet, and carried rows of serrated teeth suited to cutting flesh. It was itself a formidable hunter, capable of pursuing substantial prey in open water. Yet fossils from this period preserve evidence of interaction between sharks and pliosaurs, including tooth marks on pliosaur bones. The relationship was not necessarily one of regular predation between the adults. It was an ecosystem in which powerful hunters sometimes encountered one another, leaving traces of those encounters in stone. The smaller organisms formed the foundation beneath all of them. Teleost fish moved in dense schools, feeding on smaller animals and becoming food for larger fish, cephalopods, and marine reptiles. Ammonites filled another important part of the food web, their coiled shells drifting or swimming through the ancient water column, while larger predators searched for easier or more substantial meals. Squid-like animals, such as Boreopeltis soniae, occupied yet another branch, with their delicate internal structures preserved in the same geological formations that contain Kronosaurus. Energy moved upward through these layers. Tiny organisms supported small animals supported fish and cephalopods, and those became resources for increasingly large hunters. Ichthyosaurs and elasmosaurids occupied higher levels, while sharks added another lineage of active predation. Kronosaurus existed above this network as an animal capable of feeding on creatures that were already predators themselves. That distinction matters because apex status was not simply a matter of body size. The largest animals in the sea did not all compete directly. Their different shapes, depths, diets, and hunting methods allowed several powerful lineages to coexist. Kronosaurus occupied the position where those pathways could converge, capable of taking prey from multiple parts of the ecosystem. There is no clear fossil evidence for another animal in the Eromanga Sea that routinely threatened a healthy adult Kronosaurus. The ecosystem, therefore, contained many capable hunters, but its uppermost position remained remarkably difficult to challenge. Beneath that position stretched an intricate web of fish, shelled invertebrates, cephalopods, turtles, sharks, ichthyosaurs, and plesiosaurs, each living within the same ancient sea, each connected to the next by the simple movement of energy from one body into another. A fossil can preserve the outline of a body, but sometimes it preserves something more intimate, the remains of a meal still held inside the animal that ate it. Among Kronosaurus fossils from northern Queensland, this rare evidence includes bones belonging to sea turtles and long-necked plesiosaurs. These fragments are not inferred from tooth shape or body proportions. They are physical remnants carried into the digestive system, providing direct evidence that large marine reptiles formed part of the predator's diet. Other remains deepen the picture. Shark vertebrae have been found within fossilized gut contents associated with Kronosaurus, suggesting that sharks such as Cretoxorhina could also become prey. That possibility places Kronosaurus in an unusual feeding position because the animal was not simply consuming creatures lower in the food web. At least on some occasions, it appears to have taken predators that were themselves capable hunters. The bones left outside the body preserve another kind of record. Across the Rolling Downs group, fossil specimens bear deep punctures with rounded outlines, arranged in patterns that correspond closely with the size and spacing of Kronosaurus teeth. A convincing match requires more than a similar hole. The cross-section of the damage, the diameter of each puncture, and the distance between individual marks all have to agree with the anatomy of the suspected predator. In several cases, those measurements align closely enough to make the identity of the biter much more than a general possibility. The skull of Eromangosaurus carries one of the more revealing examples. Its bones contain crushing and puncture damage consistent with Kronosaurus dentition, including repeated contacts in nearby regions. Such repetition can preserve traces of an encounter rather than a single incidental bite. The damaged animal may have been moving during the attack, forcing the predator to maintain contact while adjusting its jaws against a living, resisting body. Even softer-bodied prey occasionally leaves a trace. Boreopeltis sonii, a large squid-like animal known from the same geological formations, possessed a rigid internal structure called a gladius. Some specimens preserve damage that may represent Kronosaurus bites. The interpretation remains less certain than the evidence from vertebrate bone, yet it fits an animal capable of taking prey from several levels of the ecosystem. Then, in 2024, a fossil from the Eromanga Sea added another remarkable layer. Paleontologist Matt White and colleagues described an ichthyosaur, approximately 7 meters, about 23 feet, long, bearing numerous bite marks and missing sections of skeleton consistent with Kronosaurus feeding. The ichthyosaur itself was already a substantial predator, but its story did not end with its own body. Within the fossilized remains of that ichthyosaur was evidence of another animal it had consumed shortly before its death. Three levels of feeding history had become preserved within a single piece of stone. A smaller animal had been eaten by the ichthyosaur, and the ichthyosaur had then been attacked and consumed by Kronosaurus. The entire chain survived because burial and fossilization interrupted the ordinary decay of the bodies and locked their final meals into geological time. The size of the ichthyosaur makes the discovery even more informative. At roughly 7 meters, about 23 feet, it represented a substantial fraction of the length of an adult Kronosaurus. Its preserved injuries therefore document predation involving an animal that was itself large, fast, and capable of resisting an attack. Each mark carries a different kind of information. Stomach contents reveal what entered the body. Tooth punctures reveal how contact occurred. Missing bone can show where feeding continued after the initial strike. Together, these traces allow paleontologists to move beyond reconstructed behavior and into physical evidence left by actual encounters, preserved in stone long after the water that witnessed them had disappeared. In the winter of 1926, a cattle rancher named Ralph William Haslam Thomas noticed something unusual emerging from the ground at Army Downs Station near Richmond in Queensland. There was no museum nearby, no expedition camp, and no paleontologist standing over the discovery. The first clue appeared in an ordinary horse enclosure, where weathering had gradually exposed pieces of bone from the rock. Thomas could not have known what those fragments represented. They were vertebrae belonging to an enormous marine reptile that had lived more than 100 million years earlier, when the region beneath his property was covered by the Eromanga Sea. The discovery followed an earlier fragment found as far back as 1901, a piece of jaw that had initially been mistaken for part of an ichthyosaur. Albert Heber Longman eventually recognized the significance of that material and formally described Kronosaurus queenslandicus in 1924. Yet the small jaw fragment offered only a glimpse. Thomas had found something much more substantial. The specimen emerging from the rock was one of the most complete Kronosaurus skeletons ever recovered. Its discovery was remarkable, but recovering it was another matter entirely. The fossil was embedded in dense limestone, and the surrounding stone resisted ordinary excavation. Every vertebra, rib, and fragment of bone was surrounded by a hard mineral shell that had formed during geological burial and remained locked around the skeleton for millions of years. By 1931, Harvard's Museum of Comparative Zoology had organized an expedition to Australia under William E. Sheville. The team traveled into the remote Queensland interior near Hughenden, carrying the tools needed to separate the fossil from the rock. The limestone proved so difficult that conventional methods could not release the specimen efficiently. Eventually, the excavators turned to dynamite. Explosives were used to break the surrounding rock into sections that could be handled and transported. The method was practical for the circumstances, but it also transformed the fossil itself into a collection of fragments. When the excavation was finished, the remains filled 86 wooden crates. Those crates then began a journey from the Australian interior to Cambridge, Massachusetts, carrying pieces of an animal that had been entombed beneath ancient seafloor sediment for more than 100 million years. What arrived at Harvard was not a pristine skeleton waiting to be assembled. The bones had suffered extensive weathering, and important portions were missing. Some elements could be identified, others had to be reconstructed, and the eventual display would require decisions about how the incomplete animal should appear. The preparation continued for more than 25 years. The skull reached public display in 1939, while much of the remaining material stayed in Harvard storage for more than 15 years afterward. Eventually, industrialist Godfrey Lowell Cabot provided funding that allowed the museum to complete the restoration and mount the skeleton as a full display. In 1958, the completed skeleton was placed on public exhibition. By then, 32 years had passed since Thomas first noticed the bones at his station, and 27 years had passed since dynamite had opened the fossil-bearing rock. The finished mount presented Kronosaurus, with its jaws spread wide inside a glass case at the Harvard Museum of Natural History, creating the image that would become familiar to generations of visitors. Yet the display concealed a deeper problem. What stood before the public was not simply the skeleton Thomas had found. It was a reconstruction assembled from incomplete and weathered material, with missing anatomy filled through restoration. As the specimen became famous, its appearance began to influence how people understood Kronosaurus itself. Long before scientists had fully determined which parts represented the actual fossil and which parts represented someone else's interpretation. For decades, the most recognizable image of Kronosaurus was also the least reliable. Inside the Harvard Gallery, the mounted skeleton stretches to about 12.8 meters, about 42 feet, with its jaws fixed open and its immense skull dominating the display. To generations of visitors, that arrangement appeared to be a fossil record made visible. Yet beneath the painted surface, much of what seemed ancient was something else entirely. Roughly 1/3 of the mounted skeleton is plaster rather than fossil bone. Reconstruction itself is not unusual. Museums routinely restore incomplete specimens so visitors can understand the animal's proportions and movement. What makes this skeleton unusual is the extent of the additions and the confidence with which those additions were presented as a continuous body. Missing vertebrae, ribs, and other elements were shaped, attached, and painted to resemble the genuine material surrounding them. Among the most consequential additions were at least 7 extra vertebrae placed within the dorsal portion of the spine. Each added segment increased the apparent length of the animal, gradually transforming a scientifically defensible body length of roughly 10 to 11 meters, about 33 to 36 feet, into a display measuring about 12.8 meters, about 42 feet. The difference was not merely cosmetic. A longer spine changes the proportions through which scientists imagine the animal's body, swimming style, mass distribution, and relationship between skull and torso. Another alteration rose directly from the top of the skull. A large sagittal crest, a raised bony ridge running along the skull's upper surface, was constructed in plaster even though genuine Kronosaurus material does not support its presence. Because the fabricated section was finished to resemble fossil bone, the artificial structure became part of the animal's accepted visual identity. Images of the mount circulated through books, museums, illustrations, and scientific discussions, allowing an invented feature to acquire the authority of something excavated from stone. The reconstruction of the missing skull sections created another layer of uncertainty. Later discoveries provided better evidence for the anatomy of Kronosaurus, revealing that some assumptions used in the Harvard restoration were difficult to defend. Yet, the original mount remained enormously influential because it was complete, imposing, and available to generations of researchers and visitors in a way that fragmented Australian fossils could never easily match. Even the distinction between genuine bone and plaster is difficult to see from the gallery floor. Jessica Cundiff, a curatorial associate at Harvard, has explained that the boundary cannot really be identified without taking the specimen apart or examining it with instruments. Such an undertaking would be extraordinarily difficult because the mount itself has become an important historical object, as well as a famous scientific specimen. Among paleontologists, the result acquired an affectionate but revealing nickname, Plasterosaurus. The name carries no mystery once the mount is understood. It describes a skeleton in which genuine fossil evidence and 20th century reconstruction became so thoroughly blended that separating them is now a scientific problem of its own. The irony is gentle but profound. Kronosaurus became famous partly because one museum succeeded in giving the public a complete animal to look at. Yet the more famous that image became, the harder it was to see where the fossil ended and reconstruction began. The skeleton preserved in Harvard is therefore both evidence and interpretation, an ancient animal filtered through modern hands, with its real anatomy still partly hidden beneath the shape created for display. Australian researchers have continued to emphasize the importance of examining the actual fossil material rather than relying on the celebrated mount alone. Modern imaging could help separate original bone from restoration without dismantling the entire exhibition, allowing the specimen's history and its anatomy to be considered together. There is a peculiar distance between knowing an animal existed and knowing exactly what that animal was. For Kronosaurus, that distance is preserved inside a museum mount that cannot simply be opened. The Harvard skeleton has become too large, too integrated with its supporting structure, and too important to dismantle. Its permanence has created an unusual scientific barrier because the fossil bone beneath the restoration remains physically inaccessible. That matters because fossil bone is not merely a shape. Its surfaces preserve measurements, attachment points, proportions, and microscopic details that can reveal how an animal was built. Without direct access, researchers cannot easily separate original anatomy from the decisions made during reconstruction. The painted surface presents a finished animal, while the evidence needed to test that animal remains hidden within it. Even the thickness of reconstructed elements can influence interpretations of strength, movement, and body proportions, making access to the underlying material unusually valuable. Computed tomography scanning has therefore been proposed as a possible bridge between preservation and investigation. By imaging the interior without removing the mount, researchers could potentially distinguish dense fossil material from plaster and examine structures that cannot be reached by ordinary measurement. Such a study could also reveal how much of the celebrated skeleton is genuine, how much was reconstructed, and which anatomical proportions deserve another look. Yet a complete scan of the Harvard mount has not been carried out in the way needed to settle those questions. So the scientific reconstruction of Kronosaurus has gradually shifted toward other fossils in Queensland. Partial skeletons may lack the theatrical completeness of the Harvard display, but they offer something far more valuable to anatomy. Their bones can be handled directly, measured from multiple angles, scanned, compared, and examined without first having to determine which surfaces were invented by a preparator. Among the most important are specimens designated by the Queensland Museum as F10113 and F18827. Paleontologist Colin McHenry identified both as especially promising reference material in his 2009 doctoral research. Their importance lies not in being perfect skeletons, but in being accessible evidence. Each fragment can be tested against other fragments, allowing proportions to emerge from fossils rather than from a single historical reconstruction. The consequences extend beyond appearance. The original type specimen, designated 1609 is only a fragment of jaw. Albert Heber Longman used that small fossil when formally naming Kronosaurus in 1924, but its limited anatomy makes a secure comparison with the Harvard skeleton difficult. The problem was recognized decades ago. In 1962, paleontologist Samuel Paul Wells raised concerns about whether the type material could confidently be associated with the much larger skeleton that had become the public face of the species. That uncertainty does not erase what can be established. Multiple fossils demonstrate that Kronosaurus was a genuine pliosaur, a very large marine predator with powerful jaws and a specialized body for life in the sea. Yet species identity, proportions, and several details of its anatomy remain subjects of reconstruction rather than final certainty. There is something fitting about this unfinished picture. The animal once lived in a world that disappeared beneath changing seas, continents, and deep geological time. Its bones survived, but some of the most famous bones became inaccessible beneath plaster. Now the more reliable image is being assembled elsewhere from Queensland fossils that can still be touched by science, measured with modern instruments, and compared piece by piece. Kronosaurus is therefore not a finished statue from the past. It is an anatomical puzzle still being solved from stone. For Kronosaurus, the most revealing discoveries are no longer always found with a brush in the field. Some now emerge from digital models, thin slices of bone, and microscopic traces left across ancient teeth. These methods allow researchers to approach the animal through functions that a complete skeleton alone cannot reveal, turning fossil surfaces into records of movement, force, growth, and behavior. A digitized three-dimensional skull can be placed under simulated feeding loads using finite element analysis, a technique borrowed from engineering that maps how stress moves through a complex structure. Across the modeled Kronosaurus skull, strain concentrates in specific regions as the jaws close, showing which bones carried the greatest loads and where failure would become likely under extreme conditions. The result adds an important distinction to the enormous bite estimates already associated with this animal. Its skull appears to have tolerated substantial deformation while biting, carrying more strain than a similarly sized crocodilian skull under comparable loading. That pattern suggests an animal built around more than a single spectacular bite. A structure capable of absorbing repeated stress could have been valuable when prey struggled, twisted, and pushed against the jaws. Holding an animal in place demanded a different kind of engineering, from simply producing the highest possible force for an instant. The distinction changes the imagined rhythm of feeding, from one explosive closure to a sustained mechanical contest between predator, prey, water, and bone. Three-dimensional biomechanical models add another layer by reconstructing the positions and orientations of the muscles that close the jaws. Their attachment areas reveal where different muscle groups could exert the greatest influence, while the geometry of the skull helps estimate how leverage changed through the opening and closing cycle. Instead of treating the jaws as a simple pair of rigid bars, researchers can examine them as a coordinated system in which force varied according to position. The bones themselves preserve another kind of record. Histology, the study of internal bone structure through thin sections, has revealed dense networks of vascular channels in Queensland specimens. Such extensive blood supply is consistent with relatively rapid growth and a metabolism more active than that expected from many strictly ectothermic reptiles. The evidence does not turn Kronosaurus into a warm-blooded mammal, but it suggests a physiology capable of supporting greater activity and broader thermal tolerance than older assumptions allowed. That possibility carries ecological consequences. A more active metabolism requires greater energy input, which in turn places greater demands on feeding. Kronosaurus may therefore have needed regular access to substantial prey rather than surviving through long periods of low activity. Its hunting range, movement patterns, and daily energy budget could all have been shaped by this hidden physiological difference. Even the teeth retain microscopic evidence of how that life was lived. Tooth microwear analysis examines tiny scratches and pits across enamel, distinguishing contact with hard materials such as shell or bone from interactions with softer tissues. Patterns accumulated during feeding can reveal not only what the teeth encountered, but how repeatedly particular kinds of material passed through the jaws. The flippers are being reconsidered as well. Queensland specimens show that the rear pair was longer and more robust than the front pair, challenging older reconstructions that emphasize the forelimbs as the dominant source of propulsion. That difference changes the mechanics of the entire body, placing renewed attention on how power was generated and transferred through the animal. Each method removes another layer of assumption. The real Kronosaurus is emerging not from a single spectacular skeleton, but from stress maps, muscle geometry, bone structure, microscopic wear, and measurable proportions. Piece by piece, the animal beneath the myth is becoming a biological organism again, governed by the same physical rules that shaped every creature that ever moved through the sea. The first warning may have come from a change in the water itself. Long before teeth touched flesh, a moving body disturbed the surrounding water, leaving pressure patterns that could potentially be sensed by specialized organs along the head and body. In pliosaurs, a lateral line sensory system is thought to have detected such disturbances, giving Kronosaurus another way to locate nearby movement when vision was limited by depth, sediment, or fading light. Its eyes added a different advantage. The orbits were large for the size of the skull, suggesting that vision played an important role in locating prey. The upper waters of the Eromanga Sea would have received the strongest illumination, creating a natural hunting zone where fish, turtles, and other marine reptiles were active. Forward placement of the eyes may also have provided some binocular overlap, giving the animal useful depth perception during the final approach. There is also the possibility of chemical sensing. Some researchers have proposed that marine reptiles could detect dissolved chemical traces associated with living animals, although the fossil evidence cannot establish the extent of such ability in Kronosaurus. If such chemosensory information was available, it would have added another layer to a sensory system already suited to tracking movement through water. The most compelling hunting geometry comes from the animal's position in the water column. An approach from below would have exploited the contrast between the brighter surface and the darker depths beneath it. A prey animal looking upward would encounter the illuminated water above, while a predator rising from deeper water could remain difficult to distinguish against the surrounding darkness. The attack would therefore depend less on invisibility than on the simple physics of light. Kronosaurus was particularly well suited to this geometry because its neck was short. The skull occupied the leading edge of the body, so the jaws reached the target without a long neck projecting ahead of the torso. That compact arrangement reduced the distance between the first visible movement and the arrival of the teeth. Once the upward acceleration began, there was little body length between predator and prey to provide additional warning. Many potential targets were naturally positioned within this vulnerable zone. Long-necked plesiosaurs could extend their necks through the upper water while searching for fish. Sea turtles could move through the same illuminated layers while feeding. Fish schools created another concentration of motion, especially where currents gathered food. From below, these animals presented targets whose attention was directed toward the brighter space around them rather than toward the water beneath. Yet water carries information as efficiently as it carries motion. A rapidly approaching body would generate pressure disturbances that could become detectable shortly before physical contact, particularly to an animal equipped with sensitive pressure receptors. That interval may have been extremely brief. At roughly 10 kilometers per hour, about 6 miles per hour, a predator would cover several meters in only a few seconds. At roughly 16 kilometers per hour, about 10 miles per hour, the same distance would disappear even faster. This combination created a remarkably coherent hunting system. Sensory detection located movement, vision refined the target, the body rose from below, and the compact skull reached the prey at the leading edge of the attack. The comparison with modern great white sharks is therefore less about ancestry than physics. These animals evolved on separate branches of the vertebrate tree, yet both could exploit the same advantage offered by open water, approaching from beneath where light and attention favored the predator. The solution belonged not to one lineage, but to the geometry of ambush itself. Every few minutes, the surface became part of Kronosaurus's world again. Beneath the water, its body could devote itself entirely to movement and pursuit, but breathing imposed a rhythm that no anatomy could remove. Kronosaurus was a reptile, descended ultimately from animals whose ancestors lived on land, and its lungs still required atmospheric oxygen. The sea could provide nearly everything else, but not that. The exact duration of an active Kronosaurus dive cannot be measured from fossils. Its physiology is inaccessible in the way living animals can be observed, and soft tissues that would reveal respiratory capacity were lost long ago. Modern marine reptiles offer only broad comparisons. Sea turtles, for example, can remain submerged for many hours while resting, yet active swimming and feeding consume oxygen much more rapidly. For a large, active pliosaur, hunting dives were likely governed by minutes rather than the extraordinary durations sometimes associated with resting animals. That difference mattered because the surface was not simply a place to breathe. It was a boundary between two physical worlds. Rising through it meant bringing a massive body into direct view, even if only briefly. During those moments, attention would have shifted toward respiration, while the animal's movement could become less directed than during an attack. The predator that dominated deeper water therefore entered a temporary interval in which its surroundings demanded a different kind of awareness. Other large hunters occupied that boundary. Cretoxorhina, a powerful Cretaceous shark, is known from the same broad marine ecosystems, and bite marks attributed to sharks have been found on fossil pliosaurs. Such marks do not establish that adult Kronosaurus was routinely hunted by sharks. A mature animal weighing perhaps 11 to 13 metric tons, about 12 to 14 short tons, would have been an extraordinarily difficult target for a shark, even one among the larger predators of its time. Yet the marks reveal something more subtle about the ecosystem. Large predators did not necessarily respect one another as fixed ranks. Injury, opportunity, weakened condition, territorial encounters, or simple proximity could bring animals together in ways that a neat food chain cannot fully describe. A shark investigating a vulnerable moment at the surface would not need to overpower an adult pliosaur to leave a mark. A brief encounter could be enough. For Kronosaurus, the vulnerability was built into its ancestry. Its lungs were not a flaw in the ordinary sense, but an inherited solution carried into an environment where gills might have removed the need to surface. Every breath connected the animal to the atmosphere above the sea, just as surely as its flippers connected it to the water below. No amount of predatory specialization could erase that boundary. That recurring ascent would also have shaped where the animal spent its time. A predator that needed regular access to atmospheric oxygen could not treat every depth as equally available, regardless of how capable its flippers were. Depth, exertion, and recovery would have been linked by the demands of respiration, making the water column not merely a hunting space, but a physiological landscape. The richest hunting opportunities could lie far from the surface, yet every pursuit ultimately had to be balanced against the next breath. The irony reaches deeper than the surface itself. Evolution had transformed a lineage with terrestrial origins into a body capable of dominating an inland sea. Yet the old respiratory arrangement remained. The animal could become enormous, fast, heavily armed, and exquisitely adapted to aquatic hunting, but it could never become entirely independent of the air. So the greatest predator of the Eromanga Sea lived according to a rhythm written into its lungs. It descended, hunted, and moved through the water, then eventually returned to the surface to take what the ocean could never provide. For a brief interval, the boundary that sustained its life also marked the one place where its mastery of the sea was incomplete. Nothing in the fossil record tells us what a newborn Kronosaurus looked like, and that absence leaves an unusual space around the beginning of its life. The adult is represented by formidable bones, but the earliest stages remain almost entirely unseen. No confirmed embryo has been assigned to Kronosaurus, and no juvenile specimen can yet be identified with complete confidence. Even so, the biology of its relatives offers a narrow path toward understanding how such an animal may have entered the world. Pliosaurs belonged to a lineage of marine reptiles whose bodies had become deeply committed to life in the water. Their flippers were powerful swimming structures, not limbs suited to carrying a heavy pregnant body across a beach. For an animal built this way, returning to land to deposit eggs would have presented an enormous physical problem. The broader plesiosaur lineage provides the stronger clue. A specimen of Polycotylus latipinis discovered in Kansas preserved an embryo within the mother's body cavity, providing direct evidence that at least some plesiosaurs gave birth to live young in the sea. Kronosaurus cannot be placed inside that fossilized moment, so viviparity remains an inference rather than a directly observed fact. Yet, it fits the anatomy of a fully aquatic predator. A female could have carried developing young while remaining in the marine environment, eventually giving birth without ever leaving the water. The offspring may have emerged already equipped with the basic proportions of a swimmer, but the difference between being born capable and being born safe would have been enormous. A young Kronosaurus would have been large compared with many newborn animals, yet still tiny beside the adult it would eventually become. That intermediate scale may have been the most dangerous period of its existence. The Eromanga Sea contained large sharks such as Cretoxorina, along with other marine reptiles capable of exploiting vulnerable prey. Before a juvenile reached sufficient size, the same waters that supported its growth would have contained predators able to turn it into food. Growth, therefore, becomes more than a measurement. It becomes a race against exposure. Bone histology in related pliosaurs suggests rapid growth during early life, a pattern consistent with marine reptiles that benefited from reaching protective size quickly. Each new layer of bone would have recorded part of that acceleration, as the animal moved from a vulnerable young swimmer toward the massive proportions associated with adulthood. The exact pace remains uncertain. Fossil bones can preserve growth rings and changes in internal structure, allowing researchers to estimate the ages of individuals in some extinct animals. For Kronosaurus, however, a definitive life history based on such evidence has not yet been established. We do not know precisely how many years it took to reach maturity, how long adulthood lasted, or whether growth continued slowly after the animal became reproductively mature. That missing chronology leaves the later decades of a Kronosaurus life almost as distant as its beginning. A female may have entered the world in open water, grown rapidly through a hazardous juvenile stage, and eventually reached a size at which few creatures could challenge her. Somewhere along that progression, the hierarchy of the Eromanga Sea would have changed from something she had to navigate into something she occupied. The fossil record rarely preserves the ordinary rhythm between birth and death. It favors bones, teeth, and isolated moments of injury, while the long passage of a life disappears into geological time. For Kronosaurus, even the beginning remains hidden, leaving almost only the shape of an answer assembled from relatives, anatomy, and the demands of living in an ancient sea. 25 million years is difficult to hold in the mind as a measure of one predator's dominance. It is long enough for coastlines to migrate, climates to shift, and entire communities of animals to disappear and be replaced. Yet across the early Cretaceous record associated with Kronosaurus, its lineage occupied the upper reaches of the marine food web for a span approaching that immense interval, from roughly 125 million years ago to about 100 million years ago. During those millions of years, the Eromanga Sea was not a fixed place. Its margins advanced and retreated across the Australian interior, while water depth, circulation, and available habitats changed with the broader rhythms of the Cretaceous world. The animals living within it changed as well. Fish populations shifted, marine reptiles appeared and vanished, and new forms entered the food web. Through this changing setting, Kronosaurus remained a dominant large predator within the same broad region. The comparison with other famous predators gives that duration a more tangible shape. Tyrannosaurus rex occupied the fossil record for only a few million years, perhaps around 2.5 million. Modern great white sharks, in their recognizable evolutionary form, extend back roughly 11 million years. Homo sapiens has existed for only about 300,000 years. Even the entire span of recorded human history, from the earliest writing in Mesopotamia to the present, covers only around 5,000 years. Against the Kronosaurus interval, human history becomes a remarkably thin layer. The entire existence of our species could fit within that span dozens of times, while written civilization would repeat again and again across the same stretch of geological time. The comparison is not intended to make the animal seem larger than it was. It simply reveals how differently geological time moves from the scale of a human life. What makes the duration especially significant is that dominance cannot be separated from environmental change. An apex predator does not remain successful merely because its teeth are effective. It must continue finding suitable prey, navigating changing habitats, reproducing, and surviving alongside competitors as an ecosystem rearranges itself. The persistence associated with Kronosaurus therefore suggests a degree of ecological flexibility that the fossil record can only partly reveal. There is no fossil evidence of another predator occupying the same broad ecological position with comparable size and capabilities throughout this interval. That does not mean every year was identical or that every individual Kronosaurus faced no challenge. Fossils preserve fragments, not uninterrupted histories. They allow scientists to identify patterns of presence and absence, but they rarely capture every ecological transition that occurred between layers of rock. Still, A long-lived apex lineage leaves an imprint even when its exact interactions are lost. Prey animals lived under persistent selection from predators that could detect, pursue, seize, and consume them. Speed, body shape, defensive structures, schooling behavior, and habitat preference could all influence survival. Evolution does not need to produce a conscious arms race for such pressure to accumulate. Generation after generation, individuals that escaped predation were more likely to leave descendants across generations, habitats, and changing waters. The remarkable part of Kronosaurus's history is therefore not simply that it became enormous, it is that the ecological role represented by that enormous body persisted across a vast stretch of changing time. Seas shifted, communities transformed, and species came and went, while the great pliosaur remained embedded within the ancient Australian marine world. For millions upon millions of years, the top of that food web belonged to a predator whose fossilized remains now survive only as scattered pieces of the world it once dominated. There is a strange geography beneath the red interior of Australia, one that cannot be seen from the surface but can still be read in the rocks. The broad plains and dry channels of Queensland occupy ground that once lay beneath an inland sea, a marine world assembled during the early Cretaceous when global sea levels were much higher than they are today. As seawater expanded under a warmer global climate, while the ancient Gondwana supercontinent continued breaking apart, ocean water found pathways deep into the Australian continent. At its greatest reach, the Eromanga Sea covered roughly 60% of what is now Queensland and extended southward into South Australia. Its total area was comparable to the Mediterranean Sea, yet its character was different from a modern ocean basin. Much of the water was shallow enough for sunlight to penetrate into broad submerged shelves, supporting dense biological activity. Depths varied considerably, but many regions were only about 46 meters, about 150 feet, to nearly 200 meters, about 650 feet, deep. Nutrients circulated through these shallower waters, sustaining fish, marine reptiles, shell-bearing animals, and the predators that depended upon them. The climate of this vanished sea was more complicated than a simple picture of a warm Cretaceous ocean suggests. Glendonites preserved in some Eromanga Sea deposits formed under near-freezing conditions, recording periods when portions of the water approached temperatures close to the freezing point. Australia then occupied a different latitude from its modern position, and seasonal conditions could be severe even within a world experiencing elevated average temperatures. Beneath the changing sky, the sea could therefore hold both warmth and icy seasonal signals within the same broad marine system. For Kronosaurus, this geography was more than scenery. A shallow continental sea creates an enormous network of feeding grounds, channels, shelves, and productive margins. As long as those habitats remained connected and biologically rich, large predators had access to the animals that supported their existence. The sea itself became part of the predator's life history, extending far beyond any single hunting ground. Then the geography began to reverse. During the late Cretaceous, global sea levels declined as tectonic processes and climate patterns changed. The great epicontinental seas that had spread across continents began contracting. The Eromanga Sea followed the same slow retreat. Its margins did not vanish in a single event. Land emerged gradually along the edges, narrowing the shallow habitats that had supported so much marine life. Across millions of years, the productive waters withdrew toward the remaining deeper portions, while former seabeds became exposed landscapes. By about 90 million years ago, the sea had retreated substantially from central Australia. The ecological foundation that had supported Kronosaurus and its prey was disappearing with the water itself. A predator could survive changes in temperature, prey, abundance, and habitat, but it could not remain an ocean predator after the ocean had withdrawn. Today, inland Queensland carries the physical memory of that vanished world. Red earth, dry scrub, eucalyptus, and heat occupy sediments that accumulated beneath ancient water. The rocks contain the remains of animals that once moved through those submerged landscapes, preserved where the sea floor eventually became part of the continent. Layer by layer, they preserve the changing chemistry, temperature, currents, and biological richness of water that no longer has a place on any modern map. In places where the modern outback seems furthest removed from an ocean, the geological boundary between desert and ancient seabed has almost disappeared. Standing beneath the Queensland sun means standing on ground that once formed the floor of a sea more than 115 million years ago. The end of the pliosaurs did not arrive with fire from the sky. It came much earlier, spread across generations, and left no single layer of rock that can be pointed to as the moment everything changed. By the time the asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula about 66 million years ago, the great pliosaurs had already been absent for millions of years. Kronosaurus belonged to a lineage that had survived repeated transformations of the oceans, yet its final disappearance unfolded during a very different kind of crisis. Kronosaurus fades from the fossil record around 95 to 100 million years ago, while the broader pliosaur lineage appears to have vanished by approximately 89 million years ago. That places their disappearance roughly 23 million years before the asteroid impact associated with the Cretaceous-Paleogene mass extinction. The later catastrophe eliminated many major marine and terrestrial groups, including mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, pterosaurs, and the non-avian dinosaurs. The pliosaurs were already part of geological history by then. Their longevity makes the timing especially interesting. Pliosaurs had persisted through enormous changes during the Triassic and Jurassic, surviving extinction episodes that reshaped marine ecosystems and removed entire branches of life. Their bodies had repeatedly adapted to shifting seas, changing prey communities, and new competitors. There was nothing inevitable about their disappearance. Something about the mid-Cretaceous world gradually became less favorable to the ecological system that had supported them. One important change was the contraction of shallow epicontinental seas. These broad inland waters had created extensive, productive habitats, allowing marine food webs to spread across continental interiors. As sea levels changed and those environments diminished, feeding grounds became smaller and more fragmented. Prey populations were affected first, and large predators eventually felt the consequences through the long chain of energy connecting plankton, fish, marine reptiles, and apex hunters. Ocean circulation was changing as well. During the mid-Cretaceous, shifting geography and climate altered the movement of seawater and the distribution of nutrients. Productive regions could weaken, while other areas became more favorable to different communities. For a predator requiring substantial quantities of food, changes like these would not need to happen suddenly. A gradual reduction in prey availability, repeated across thousands of generations, could slowly narrow the conditions in which a large hunting animal could thrive. Then another lineage was expanding through the oceans. Mosasaurs began diversifying rapidly around 98 million years ago, occupying marine environments with bodies and hunting strategies very different from those of pliosaurs. Their rise coincided with a broader transformation in marine reptile communities. Ichthyosaurs disappeared at roughly 94 million years ago, close to the period when several other established marine groups were undergoing major changes. The ocean was not emptying, it was being reorganized. That distinction matters. There is no established evidence for a single disaster that suddenly erased the pliosaurs. Instead, the available record is consistent with a prolonged ecological withdrawal, with populations becoming smaller, ranges contracting, and successful reproduction becoming increasingly difficult as environments changed. Competition may have contributed, but it was likely part of a larger restructuring involving habitat, prey, climate, and ocean circulation. The fossil record cannot show the final Kronosaurus swimming through its last season, nor can it identify the precise generation in which the balance finally failed. There is no preserved moment of collapse. Somewhere within those vanished populations, however, reproduction eventually ceased to replace mortality. One generation became fewer animals than the generation before it, and then fewer still. The great lineage that had occupied the oceans for millions of years did not end on a single day. It ended gradually until the sea carried on without it. A fossil from Colombia once seemed to widen the map of Kronosaurus across an ancient world. Found in the Boyacá region and described in 1992, the specimen was named Kronosaurus boyacensis, a second species placed within the same genus as the Australian predator. Its skull and associated body material were preserved with unusual detail, creating a rare glimpse of a large pliosaur from another part of the early Cretaceous oceans. The geography of that time makes the discovery less improbable than it might appear today. Colombia occupied a very different position during the early Cretaceous, within a network of marine environments connected to the broader Tethys Sea. Oceanic pathways and shallow continental waters formed a shifting system across a planet whose continents had not yet reached their modern arrangement. Large marine reptiles were capable of dispersing through these connected habitats, and the presence of related animals far from Queensland could therefore fit within a wider southern hemisphere pattern. For decades, the Columbian animal remained a second Kronosaurus, and its existence seemed to support an unusually broad distribution for the genus. The fossil itself, preserved at the Museo Paleontologico de Villa de Leyva, carried an importance that extended beyond its museum setting. It offered another anatomical reference point for understanding the group, particularly because the Australian material had become entangled with the reconstruction problems surrounding the famous Harvard specimen. Then the Columbian fossils were examined again. In 2022, paleontologists returned to the anatomy of the specimen and found differences substantial enough to separate it from Australian Kronosaurus. The distinction was not a matter of minor variation within one widespread species. The Columbian animal possessed a combination of anatomical features that warranted recognition as its own genus. Kronosaurus boyacensis became Monquirasaurus boyacensis. That change reduced the recognized species of Kronosaurus to one, Kronosaurus queenslandicus from Australia. Yet, the removal of the Columbian animal from the genus did not make the discovery less important. In some ways, it made the story more intricate. The two animals were distinct enough to occupy separate genera, while still retaining enough shared anatomy to reveal a common evolutionary relationship within the larger pliosaur lineage. Their separation also places a subtle problem at the center of Southern Hemisphere paleontology. Related marine predators existed in regions that are now separated by continents and thousands of kilometers of land, but those barriers did not exist in their modern form when these animals lived. The populations may have dispersed through open marine routes, followed connected shallow seas, or descended from ancestral populations that occupied a wider range before continental separation progressed. Each possibility carries a different history of movement and isolation. Open water could have allowed repeated dispersal between suitable habitats, while shallow marine corridors may have provided stepping stones across a changing landscape. Alternatively, an older ancestral population might have been divided as the geography of Gondwana transformed, leaving related descendants in distant seas. The fossil record does not yet distinguish these histories with confidence. Southern Hemisphere pliosaur paleobiogeography remains comparatively underdeveloped, with large gaps between known specimens and long intervals in which entire regional ecosystems are represented only by fragments. The Columbian discovery, therefore, became more than a misplaced species name. It became evidence that the evolutionary story surrounding Kronosaurus extends beyond Australia, while also showing how easily a familiar name can conceal a more complicated biological history. Beneath the revised classification is a broader pattern, preserved across oceans that have since disappeared. The lineage was not confined to one ancient coastline. Its relatives occupied a wider southern hemisphere world, and the connections between those populations remain only partly visible in stone. The identity of Kronosaurus rests on an unexpectedly small piece of anatomy. The fossil that carries the official name of the species is not the enormous skull preserved in a museum, nor one of the more complete Queensland skeletons studied by modern researchers. It is a fragment of lower jaw, catalogued as Queensland Museum Specimen F1609. And it was this modest piece that became the type specimen when Albert Heber Longman named Kronosaurus queenslandicus in 1924. A type specimen has a special role in zoological naming. It serves as the physical reference to which a scientific name is permanently anchored, allowing later researchers to compare other fossils against the original material. For Kronosaurus, that foundation is unusually fragile. The jaw fragment is small and incomplete, while the precise locality where it was collected was not recorded clearly enough in the historical literature to provide the detailed geological context modern paleontologists would normally want. That missing provenance matters because a fossil is not defined only by its bones. The layer surrounding those bones records when the animal lived and places it within a particular geological sequence. Without that information, matching a fragment to much larger skeletons becomes more difficult. Two animals can possess similar anatomical features while belonging to different species, or even to different branches of the same broader lineage. The Harvard skeleton adds another layer of uncertainty. Its specimen number is Museum of Comparative Zoology 1285, and it came from a different Queensland locality than the original jaw fragment. For generations, the enormous mounted skeleton became the image associated with Kronosaurus. But whether that specimen can be demonstrated to belong to exactly the same species represented by the type fragment has remained a legitimate taxonomic concern. Samuel Paul Wells brought the problem into formal discussion in 1962. His concern was straightforward in principle, but profound in consequence. If the original jaw is too fragmentary to establish the animal represented by the name, then later specimens cannot simply inherit that identity because they resemble the famous fossil. The name must remain connected to evidence that can support the assignment. This is where taxonomy becomes less like labeling and more like reconstructing a chain of evidence. Colin McHenry examined the problem in his 2009 doctoral thesis and identified Queensland Museum specimens F10113 and F18827 as promising candidates for neotypes. A neotype is a replacement type specimen selected when the original material is inadequate for resolving the identity of a species. These Queensland fossils are substantially more informative because they can be measured, examined, and compared in detail, providing a stronger physical foundation for the name. Yet the proposed replacement has not been formally adopted. Until that happens, the scientific identity remains tied to the old fragment, despite the extraordinary amount of anatomical knowledge gathered from other specimens. There is an almost poetic imbalance in that arrangement. The animal itself is increasingly understood through modern imaging, biomechanics, histology, and carefully preserved Queensland fossils, while the name used to gather all that knowledge still rests upon a piece of jaw whose original geological setting is uncertain. Kronosaurus is therefore not imaginary, nor is its existence in serious doubt. The uncertainty lies deeper in the precise connection between a name and the animal that name is meant to identify. For more than 60 years, paleontologists have known that this foundation is imperfect. The great predator has become one of the most recognizable marine reptiles of the Cretaceous, yet its formal identity remains attached to a fragment that may never be sufficient to settle the matter on its own. Some fossils preserve more than the shape of an animal. They preserve the moment when one animal met another, compressed into scars that remained after flesh, water, and time had disappeared. Along the broken surfaces of ancient bones, punctures and gouges can retain the geometry of a bite, allowing paleontologists to treat damaged skeletons as physical records of encounters that occurred 115 million years ago. A tooth entering bone leaves more than a simple hole. Its cross-section influences the outline of the puncture. Its diameter determines the breadth of the opening, and the spacing between neighboring teeth creates a pattern that can be compared with the arrangement of a predator's dentition. For a confident identification, those independent features need to converge. Shape, diameter, and spacing must agree closely enough that another predator becomes an unlikely explanation. In the case of Kronosaurus, the characteristic damage consists of deep, circular to oval punctures whose proportions fit the robust conical teeth preserved in its jaws. One particularly revealing example comes from Eromanga another marine reptile of the Eromanga Sea. Its skull bears crushing and puncture damage that corresponds closely with the expected geometry of Kronosaurus teeth. The marks are not arranged as though a single tooth merely touched the bone and withdrew. Repeated contacts occur at similar angles, producing a pattern consistent with prolonged engagement. Such damage can preserve a glimpse of movement because a struggling animal would shift beneath the predator while the jaws maintained contact, changing the exact points of impact without erasing the overall pattern. Another specimen, described in 2024 from an ichthyosaur, offers a different kind of evidence. Portions of bone are missing entirely, while the remaining edges preserve crushing characteristics associated with the rear teeth of Kronosaurus. The pattern is consistent with force being applied from below and behind, a direction that fits the broader mechanics of an upward ambush. Here, the prey skeleton becomes more than evidence that a bite occurred. It retains clues about where the predator was positioned when contact began. The same physical scars can also help estimate force. Bone is not an abstract material. Its resistance to penetration can be measured experimentally, allowing researchers to relate the width and depth of a puncture to the mechanical energy required to produce it. That creates an independent route toward estimating bite strength, separate from reconstructing muscles or simulating stresses through a digital skull. When damage-based calculations converge with finite element models of the Kronosaurus skull, confidence grows because the two methods begin with entirely different evidence. The value extends beyond force. The orientation of punctures can indicate the angle of attack. Their distribution across a skeleton can suggest which region of the body received the initial contact. Clusters of marks may reveal repeated biting, repositioning, or prolonged feeding rather than a single decisive strike. Even fractures can preserve traces of how pressure traveled through bone as the jaws closed. The surrounding bone can also reveal whether damage occurred before burial, because fresh fractures behave differently from breaks produced much later by sediment pressure or geological distortion. That distinction helps separate genuine feeding traces from marks created after death. Every damaged vertebra, rib, and cranial fragment therefore carries a small mechanical history. The predator is gone, the prey is gone, and the sea that held them has vanished. Yet the stone preserves the geometry of their encounter. What once lasted only moments can remain measurable across immense spans of geological time, allowing modern science to read an ancient attack not through imagination, but through the physical marks that force itself left behind. There is a remarkable point where two distant branches of evolution seem to arrive at nearly the same design. One animal moved through an ancient sea, the other across late Cretaceous landscapes, yet both developed skulls that became the defining architecture of their bodies. Kronosaurus and Tyrannosaurus rex never met, never hunted the same prey, and were separated by tens of millions of years. Their resemblance emerged without any shared experience, guided instead by similar physical demands. Tyrannosaurus rex belonged to the theropod dinosaurs, a lineage ultimately closer to birds than to any marine reptile. It lived in North America between 68 and 66 million years ago. Kronosaurus belonged to the pliosaurs, a branch of the plesiosaur lineage more closely related to modern lizards and snakes. Its world was an ocean. Its propulsion came from flippers, and its attacks unfolded through water rather than across land. The evolutionary distance between them could hardly be greater, yet the broad proportions of their hunting apparatus followed a strikingly similar pattern. In both animals, the skull became enormous relative to the rest of the body, occupying roughly 1/4 of total body length. Their teeth were predominantly conical and built to seize rather than slice through flesh like the blades of a cutting predator. Behind those teeth, powerful jaw-closing muscles provided the force needed to drive the skull's foremost weapon into resistant prey. Neither animal appears to have faced a regularly competing adult predator of comparable capability within its ecological role. Each occupied a position where the ability to seize, hold, and process substantial prey became more important than specialization for a narrow feeding method. The similarity becomes more interesting when the environments are placed side by side. Kronosaurus reached its ecological prominence roughly 115 million years ago, while Tyrannosaurus rex appeared roughly 47 million years later. One ruled a marine ecosystem, the other a terrestrial one. Their prey moved through different physical media. Their bodies were supported in fundamentally different ways, and their respiratory systems evolved within separate histories. Even the landscapes surrounding them belonged to different chapters of Earth. What remained similar was the mechanical problem. A predator weighing perhaps 10 to 15 tons must capture prey capable of resisting the attack. The skull must withstand enormous forces while the jaws close with enough strength to secure the animal. Teeth must penetrate without becoming fragile, and the muscles must generate force through a structure capable of transmitting that load into the prey. Those requirements exist independently of ancestry. Water or land changes how the body approaches its target, but it does not change the underlying behavior of bone under stress, the leverage of muscles, or the need for a secure grip. That is the essence of convergent evolution, Unrelated organisms can arrive at comparable solutions because natural selection repeatedly encounters the same constraints. Wings appeared in insects, birds, and bats. Streamlined bodies emerged among animals moving through water from entirely different lineages. Here, the convergence occurred in the architecture of an apex predator's skull. Kronosaurus and Tyrannosaurus rex, therefore, tell a larger story than either animal could tell alone. Their similarity is not evidence that evolution follows a fixed blueprint. It is evidence that certain physical problems narrow the range of workable solutions. When an animal becomes large enough, powerful enough, and specialized enough to occupy the highest level of a food web, the laws governing force and structure begin to shape its anatomy in remarkably consistent ways. Different lineages can reach the same summit by entirely separate paths because the mountain itself is built from physics. When a dominant predator disappears, the sea does not remain unchanged for long. Its absence alters the relationships among everything that remains, opening space for another hunter to occupy the same broad position. After the decline of the pliosaurs between roughly 95 and 89 million years ago, the great ambush predator niche they had occupied across ancient marine ecosystems became available again. The animals that moved into that space were not descendants of Kronosaurus. They belonged to an entirely different reptilian lineage, one closer to modern monitor lizards. Mosasaurs began diversifying rapidly during the late Cretaceous, eventually producing forms such as Mosasaurus hoffmanii, which reached lengths of about 17 meters, roughly 57 feet, in the largest known examples. Their bodies, skulls, and methods of movement differed from those of pliosaurs, yet their ecological position could look remarkably familiar. They became large marine hunters capable of pursuing substantial prey through the open sea. This replacement was not a simple handoff between two related predators. Evolution had built another solution to the same environmental opportunity. Mosasaurs developed powerful jaws, elongated bodies, and specialized adaptations for life in seawater, transforming animals descended from terrestrial ancestors into ocean predators. The resemblance to earlier marine reptiles, therefore, carried a deeper pattern. The sea had lost one lineage capable of controlling the upper levels of its food webs, and another lineage independently expanded into that same territory. By roughly 98 million years ago, mosasaurs were becoming increasingly important components of marine ecosystems, and they remained prominent until the end of the Cretaceous, about 66 million years ago. Their success shows that the disappearance of one apex predator does not necessarily leave an ecosystem permanently diminished. Prey populations can experience changing pressures as a new hunter arrives, while competitors are reshaped by the altered distribution of food. The identity of the dominant predator matters, but the ecological position itself can remain remarkably persistent. Then the pattern was interrupted once more. The asteroid impact at the end of the Cretaceous eliminated the great marine reptiles, along with the non-avian dinosaurs and many other organisms. For a time, the oceans no longer contained the enormous reptilian predators that had shaped marine food webs for so long. The vacancy was real, but it was temporary in the larger rhythm of evolutionary history. Much later, another group of air-breathing vertebrates returned to the sea. Their arrival was not an immediate replacement, but a gradual reoccupation of a role that had been vacant for millions of years. Different bodies entered the water, different senses became important, and different methods of pursuing prey evolved. Whales descended from terrestrial mammals, gradually transforming limbs, bodies, breathing systems, and feeding strategies for an aquatic existence. Their history echoes the older transition that produced marine reptiles, although the evolutionary paths were entirely separate. Among living animals, the sperm whale offers one of the closest functional parallels to the kind of predator Kronosaurus represented. It can descend beyond 2,000 meters, about 6,600 feet, and hunt in darkness using echolocation, while its enormous head dominates the architecture of its body. It breathes atmospheric oxygen, carries a powerful feeding apparatus, and occupies a high position within the marine food web. The resemblance is not ancestry, it is function returning in another form. Across deep time, oceans repeatedly produce large predators when the resources and ecological structure allow them to exist. The bodies change, the lineages disappear, and new ones emerge, yet the uppermost role remains available, waiting for evolution to fill it again. The road into Richmond crosses a landscape that gives almost no outward sign of its former life. Today, the town sits among red earth, sparse vegetation, and broad stretches of Queensland country beneath an enormous sky. In summer, temperatures can rise beyond 38 degrees Celsius, about 100 degrees Fahrenheit, while the ground around the town appears as dry and permanent as any landscape could be. Yet beneath that surface lies a different geography entirely, preserved in layers of stone. Richmond stands within one of the most important regions for understanding the Eromanga Sea, and the Kronosaurus Corner Museum has become a focal point for the fossils recovered from it. Inside, its collections are marine reptiles that once occupied an ocean where the town now stands. The name of the museum itself carries an echo of that vanished world, linking a modern inland community with a predator that lived here when the surrounding continent was partly submerged. The geology beneath Richmond preserves that connection with unusual clarity. The Tullabuck Formation and the Alaru Mudstone belong to the Rolling Downs group, a sequence of fine-grained limestone and mudstone deposited across the ancient seafloor. These sediments accumulated between approximately 115 and 95 million years ago, as marine waters covered large portions of what is now inland Queensland. Layer by layer, particles settled through the water and collected on the bottom, eventually becoming rock beneath the weight of everything deposited above them. That transformation also preserved the remains of animals that lived within those waters. A shell, a vertebra, a tooth, or a fragment of skull could become enclosed within the sediment before currents scattered it away. Over immense spans of time, the seafloor hardened, the sea withdrew, and the buried remains became part of the geological structure of the land. What appears today as an ordinary outcrop can therefore contain a biological record assembled from creatures that never encountered the landscape in its present form. The museum also gives these discoveries a physical setting, allowing visitors to encounter reconstructed skeletons alongside the fossils themselves. That matters because the distance between an ancient marine predator and a modern inland town can otherwise feel abstract. Here, the specimens connect the geology beneath the streets with animals that once depended on the same water, currents, food, and seafloor conditions preserved in the surrounding formations. The record is still being uncovered. Erosion gradually removes exposed material, and seasonal rainfall can strip away portions of weathered rock, revealing fossils that were hidden beneath the surface before. Paleontologists continue surveying the region, finding additional remains of ichthyosaurs, elasmosaurid plesiosaurs, and pliosaurs within the same broad geological sequence. The discovery of a remarkable ichthyosaur specimen in 2024, preserving evidence of a three-level predation chain, came from this wider fossil landscape. For anyone standing above it, The country offers few clues about what lies below. Beneath roughly 9 meters, about 30 feet of earth and rock, the ancient seafloor can still be present in stone. Fossil bones occupy positions within those layers that once belonged to a living ecosystem, surrounded by sediments, deposited while sunlight entered shallow water, and marine animals moved through a world that had no reason to imagine becoming desert. The strange part is not simply that an ocean once existed here, it is that its disappearance did not erase it completely. The water is gone, the shoreline has vanished, and the animals that moved through the Eromanga Sea have been absent for millions of years. Yet, their bodies remain embedded beneath modern Queensland, waiting for erosion, careful excavation, and patient interpretation to bring fragments of that vanished ecosystem back into view. For most animals in the Eromanga Sea, survival was written into ordinary movements. A feeding excursion toward brighter water, a change in depth, or a decision to remain among others could alter the chances of becoming visible to something larger. The presence of Kronosaurus therefore reached into parts of life that fossil bones cannot preserve, shaping behavior long before any attack actually began. An elasmosaurid plesiosaur, moving near the surface, would have carried much of its attention upward and forward. Its long neck allowed it to search through the upper water for fish, but that same posture left the space beneath it difficult to monitor. The animal could scan the world ahead, while an approaching predator occupied a direction outside its most useful field of attention. For a hunter built around a powerful head and a rapid closing movement, that difference in awareness mattered. Further down, a sea turtle measuring about 1.2 meters, about 4 feet, across could appear heavily protected by its shell. Yet armor did not make it irrelevant to a predator capable of applying crushing pressure with the rear teeth. The shell offered resistance, but it also created a broad, recognizable body profile. For an apex hunter, prey did not need to be helpless. It only needed to be large enough to justify the energy spent capturing it. There was another layer to this relationship, one that existed before teeth touched bone. Water carries disturbances remarkably well, and marine animals can detect changes in pressure and movement around their bodies. At close range, the pressure wave produced by an approaching Kronosaurus could have reached nearby prey perhaps 1 or 2 seconds before contact. Against a predator closing at 10 kilometers per hour, about 6 miles per hour, or 16 kilometers per hour, about 10 miles per hour, that interval offered little opportunity for a complete escape once the attack was underway. The consequences would have accumulated across generations. Animals feeding near the surface might have altered the hours when they entered exposed water. Groups could have tightened their spacing, dispersed more rapidly, or changed direction when unusual movement approached. Fish might have favored particular depths, while slower animals could have remained closer to structures that complicated an attack from beneath. None of these behaviors can be recovered directly from a fossil skeleton, yet evolutionary pressure can leave indirect traces in anatomy, sensory systems, body shape, and the places where animals repeatedly chose to feed. That is where the importance of an apex predator becomes larger than the number of animals it consumed. Kronosaurus was part of the selective environment experienced by every species that fell within its potential prey range. Over time, individuals that detected danger sooner maneuvered more effectively, traveled at safer depths, or chose less exposed feeding grounds could leave more descendants. The predator did not need to attack every member of a species to influence its evolution. A sea can therefore contain invisible boundaries created by predation. One layer of water may offer abundant food, while another carries greater exposure. An open route may shorten a journey while increasing vulnerability. A moment spent surfacing may provide access to oxygen or sunlight while also creating an opportunity for something below. Kronosaurus shaped that behavioral geography simply by existing within it. Every animal sharing its waters lived beneath a set of pressures that did not need to be seen to be real. The fossil record preserves teeth, bones, shells, and wounds, but the deeper legacy of the predator lies in all the choices those living animals may have made to avoid becoming part of it. Long before paleontology gave ancient animals formal names, people had already given the unseen inhabitants of water a place in their stories. The Leviathan of Hebrew scripture emerged as a creature whose strength placed it beyond ordinary human power, a being of the sea, described in the book of Job with imagery of immense scale and untamable force. In Norse tradition, Jörmungandr became the Midgard serpent, so vast that its body encircled the world. Across the Caribbean, stories of the Lusca attached a monstrous presence to blue holes, those deep, flooded caverns whose darkness concealed what could not easily be observed. In Aboriginal Australian traditions, the bunyip became associated with inland waterways and dangerous creatures within a landscape that once held a very different kind of water. These traditions arose independently, yet they share a striking feature. The unknown beneath the surface repeatedly became a place where ordinary limits ceased to apply. Water hides distance, shape, direction, and movement. A creature only a few meters, about several feet, away can become difficult to distinguish from the surrounding darkness, while ripples and pressure can announce something large without revealing its form. For communities living beside rivers, lakes, coastal waters, and open seas, the surface was a boundary between the familiar world above and an environment that human bodies were poorly suited to enter. Modern technology has changed the amount we can observe, but not the fundamental nature of that boundary. Satellites can map the surface of the ocean, while remotely operated vehicles can reach places that people cannot safely visit themselves. Even so, much of the seafloor remains incompletely explored, and countless marine species have yet to be documented. The ocean continues to preserve an enormous difference between seeing the surface and knowing what exists beneath it. For most of geological history, that hidden world was inhabited by animals whose bodies were shaped by pressures very different from those governing life on land. Large marine reptiles developed streamlined bodies, powerful jaws, specialized teeth, and sensory systems suited to hunting in a three-dimensional environment. Some were built for speed, others for pursuit, and others for ambush. Their existence required no mythology. Natural selection had already produced forms that could occupy ecological roles so extreme that later human stories sometimes seem almost restrained beside them. Kronosaurus belongs to that reality rather than to legend. It was a marine reptile that breathed air, lived in the ancient Australian inland sea, and belonged to a lineage that had evolved through millions of years of oceanic change. Its enormous skull and robust teeth were not symbols invented to represent an imaginary monster. They were functional structures, shaped by feeding, competition, reproduction, and survival. That distinction matters because myths enlarge what humans cannot see, while fossils preserve what actually was. The fossil record does not tell us that an ancient sea monster waited beneath every wave. It gives something more precise. It preserves the difference between metaphor and anatomy, between a creature imagined to embody danger and an animal whose teeth, bones, and feeding traces can still be examined after millions of years. Perhaps that is why the old stories feel strangely familiar beside the fossils. The myths belong to human imagination, but the underlying intuition is older than any written tradition. Water has always concealed another world, and sometimes that world truly contained animals beyond the scale of ordinary human experience. There is a scale of time that language can describe, but the mind struggles to inhabit. 115 million years is easy to pronounce, yet almost impossible to carry as a lived duration. Kronosaurus offers a rare way to make that distance tangible, because its existence can be followed through things that still remain: teeth, bones, rock, and the changing landscape that slowly carried them from an ancient sea into the present. Human civilization occupies only a narrow instant within that span. From the earliest known writing in Mesopotamia to the modern world is roughly 5,500 years. Set against 115 million years, that entire history represents only a tiny fraction of the interval separating us from Kronosaurus. Kingdoms have risen and vanished, languages have transformed, cities have been built and abandoned, and generations beyond counting have passed through the world. Yet all of them together occupy only a thin layer above the deeper history beneath our feet. Even the dinosaurs most familiar to us belong to a later chapter. Tyrannosaurus lived about 66 million years ago, roughly 47 million years after Kronosaurus had already become part of the fossil record. Between those two worlds, continents shifted, climates changed, and entire ecosystems were replaced. The Atlantic Ocean widened by thousands of miles as the continents moved apart. Mountain ranges rose through collisions between tectonic plates and were gradually worn down again. The magnetic field of Earth reversed polarity many times, leaving changes recorded in rocks across the planet. The transformation did not happen in a single grand movement. It accumulated almost imperceptibly. Sediment settled over the remains of animals on the ancient seafloor, layer after layer, eventually surrounding bone with mineral-rich material. Burial continued as more sediment arrived. Pressure increased. The sediments hardened into rock, while the buried remains became part of a geological structure that would persist through immense changes at the surface. Much later, erosion began working in the opposite direction. Rock that had once been buried beneath other layers was gradually brought closer to daylight. Rainwater moved through cracks, soil accumulated and disappeared, and the surface of Queensland changed again and again. Somewhere within that long sequence, a piece of fossil bone or a tooth could emerge from the ground, waiting for a human eye to recognize that it did not belong to the present. That is one of the strangest qualities of deep time. It does not pass like an afternoon, a lifetime, or even a civilization. It passes through processes that operate on scales of sediment, erosion, tectonic movement, and biological change. Time becomes something expressed through landscapes rather than clocks. The survival of Kronosaurus itself is therefore part of the story. Most organisms that have ever existed left no identifiable fossil behind. Their bodies returned to the environment, their traces dissolved, scattered, or were buried beyond recovery. Yet, some Kronosaurus bones endured long enough for mineral replacement and geological preservation to maintain their structure, including the surfaces that record interactions with other animals. A fossil tooth makes that distance especially tangible. Held in the present, it was once attached to a living predator that breathed the air above an ancient sea, moved through water, fed, and eventually died. The tooth then remained embedded in the earth while everything familiar around it changed. Continents moved, seas vanished, mountains appeared, Species replaced species. Human beings eventually arrived. The tooth did not experience those changes as a story. It simply remained part of the planet through them. In that sense, Kronosaurus gives deep time a physical form, something small enough to hold, yet old enough to connect the present with a world separated from us by an almost unimaginable stretch of Earth's history. There is a recurring shape to the history of dominant predators. They appear when an ecosystem can support them, expand into the spaces their bodies and senses allow them to occupy, and remain powerful for as long as the surrounding system continues to provide what their way of life requires. Then something changes. Sometimes the change arrives as catastrophe. More often, it unfolds through climate, habitat, prey, and competition, slowly enough that no single moment can be named as the beginning of the end. Kronosaurus belongs to that slower pattern. By roughly 95 to 100 million years ago, its world was changing beneath it. The shallow marine environments of inland Australia were contracting, and the communities of animals that had supported large predators were being reorganized. A predator could remain physically capable while the conditions that made its existence possible became less reliable. The disappearance was therefore not a failure of strength. It was a mismatch between an animal and the changing architecture of its ecosystem. The same distinction appears in the history of the mosasaurs. They rose into large marine predator roles after the decline of the pliosaurs and persisted through much of the late Cretaceous. Then, about 66 million years ago, the asteroid impact and resulting global environmental disruption ended their lineage along with many other large organisms. Their disappearance had a different immediate cause from that of Kronosaurus, yet the underlying dependence remained. A giant predator requires an enormous ecological foundation beneath it. Much later, Otodus megalodon reached a scale unmatched by any known shark. Estimates place its maximum length at about 18 meters, about 60 feet, and its position near the top of marine food webs depended on abundant large prey. Around 3.6 million years ago, its lineage disappeared during a period of climatic and oceanographic change. Cooling waters, shifting marine communities, and changes in the distribution of large prey have all been considered important factors. Again, the predator did not simply become less capable. The world supporting its particular form of dominance changed. On land, the pattern appears again. Dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, and American lions occupied powerful positions within Pleistocene ecosystems, yet all disappeared near the end of that epoch. Their bodies represented substantial energetic investments, and large predators could not remain insulated from changes affecting herbivores, prey distributions, vegetation, and climate. When the foundation moved, the animals standing highest above it eventually felt the movement. This is one reason apex predators are so revealing in the fossil record. Their disappearance can expose changes that begin much farther down the food web. A decline in prey abundance can eventually become a decline in predator numbers. Fragmented habitat can reduce hunting opportunities. Climate can alter migration routes, breeding grounds, and seasonal productivity. For an animal requiring enormous quantities of food, even a gradual reduction can accumulate into a profound biological constraint. Kronosaurus did not need to become weaker to disappear. Its environment only needed to become different enough that the balance supporting its enormous body could no longer be maintained. The sea contracted, prey communities shifted, ecological connections loosened across generations until the lineage ended. That pattern reaches beyond extinct reptiles and ancient mammals. Dominance has never been permanent in the history of life. Every apex predator exists within a network larger than itself, dependent upon climate, habitat, prey, reproduction, and the stability of everything beneath it. Even the species occupying the highest position today remains part of that same biological rule. The fossil record does not promise permanence to anything. It shows, again and again, that the role may survive while the species holding it eventually does not. The modern ocean carries a different cast of predators, yet some of its oldest evolutionary themes remain recognizable. 66 million years ago, the extinction that ended the Cretaceous removed the mosasaurs, the remaining plesiosaurs, and many other large marine animals in a geological instant. For a time, the spaces they had occupied were no longer filled by creatures of comparable size. Sharks, large predatory fish, and early whales moved through an altered world where the great marine reptiles were gone. The change did not last forever. Mammals that had once walked on land gradually returned to the sea, their descendants reshaping themselves across millions of years. Limbs became flippers, bodies became streamlined, and breathing remained tied to the surface, even as the animals spent their lives beneath it. Whales eventually occupied an extraordinary range of marine roles, from filter-feeding giants to hunters that pursue prey in the darkness. The blue whale represents one path through this transformation. Reaching about 30½ meters, about 100 feet in length, and weighing roughly 200 tons, it is the largest animal known to have existed. Yet it does not resemble Kronosaurus in the most obvious ecological sense. It does not chase individual prey with jaws. Instead, its enormous body is supported by filtering vast quantities of tiny organisms from seawater. The same ocean that once supported enormous hunters can also support enormous animals whose survival depends upon consuming life at the smallest scales. Another whale follows a very different design. The sperm whale can reach about 18 meters, about 60 feet, and descend beyond 2,000 meters, about 6,600 feet, into waters where sunlight no longer reaches. Its enormous head contains a sophisticated, sound-producing and receiving system, allowing it to locate prey through echolocation. Giant squid become part of this deep water hunting world, and the encounter between predator and prey unfolds far below the surface, where pressure, darkness, and distance replace the shallow seas, once inhabited by marine reptiles. Orcas demonstrate another dimension of modern marine predation. Their hunting can involve cooperation, learned techniques, and attacks directed toward animals larger than an individual hunter. Great white sharks can become targets, and even the largest whales may be approached through coordinated behavior. The resemblance to ancient apex predators is not anatomical. It lies in ecological position, intelligence, flexibility, and the ability to influence the behavior of other powerful animals. Far beneath the surface, however, much of the ocean remains beyond direct human experience. The deep sea, beginning around 1,000 meters, about 3,300 feet, is an immense realm of pressure, darkness, and scattered biological communities. New sharks, cephalopods, fishes, and other organisms continue to enter scientific records, sometimes carrying body forms and behaviors that had never been documented before. The important difference between this ocean and the Eromanga Sea is not that the sea has become tame, it is that its extraordinary forms have changed. The ancient reptiles are gone, their bones preserved in stone, while living descendants follow entirely different evolutionary paths. Yet the underlying experiment continues, where energy, opportunity, and ecological space converge, evolution repeatedly builds animals capable of occupying the highest levels of marine food webs. That continuity matters because apex predation is not a single body plan preserved unchanged through time. It is a recurring ecological opportunity, shaped differently by anatomy, climate, prey, and the physics of each habitat. The ocean keeps offering new solutions, sometimes through teeth, sometimes through cooperation, sometimes through sheer size. What survives is not the monster itself, but the possibility that an ocean can produce one. The ocean has never needed Kronosaurus to remain extraordinary. Its history shows that when one lineage disappears, another can eventually reshape the same environment into something entirely new. A fossil does not announce itself as a memory. It begins as something much simpler, a fragment of bone, a tooth, a shape preserved where an animal once passed through the world. Only much later does another species arrive, examine that fragment, and give it a place in a story. Kronosaurus exists in that strange space between vanished life and present knowledge. Its bones are held in museums, including the Harvard Museum of Natural History and the Kronosaurus Corner in Richmond, Queensland. A tooth can extend farther than a human forearm, yet the object itself remains only part of what once moved through warm Cretaceous water. The animal that carried it is gone. What remains is physical evidence, preserved through burial, mineral alteration, geological pressure, erosion, discovery, and study. There is something precise about that connection. A tooth in a museum case is not merely an image of the past. Its mineral structure formed within a living animal. The same matter that once belonged to a predator moving through the Eromanga Sea now rests beneath controlled lighting, separated from that ancient environment by more than 100 million years. The distance between those moments is measured not only in time, but in every geological transformation that occurred between them. Kronosaurus could never have understood any of this. It had no concept of extinction, fossils, museums, or scientific reconstruction. It did not know that the sea around it would eventually retreat, that sediment would bury its remains, or that changing continents and climates would transform its world beyond recognition. Its life required none of those ideas. It simply occupied its environment, hunted, fed, reproduced, and eventually died. Human beings introduced another layer into the history of life. We became capable of using evidence from the present to reconstruct events that happened millions of years before our species existed. Microscopes reveal structures too small for the eye. Geological analysis establishes the age and origin of rocks. Comparative anatomy connects isolated bones to bodies that can no longer be observed. Mathematics allows scientists to estimate forces, motion, growth, and proportions from structures preserved in stone. That process does not bring Kronosaurus back. It does something more subtle. It converts absence into knowledge without pretending that the missing animal can ever be observed directly. Every reconstruction carries limits. Every interpretation depends upon evidence, and every new fossil can refine what came before. Science works through that continual conversation between what remains and what can reasonably be inferred. Its strength lies partly in restraint, in recognizing where evidence ends while still pursuing every conclusion that the surviving evidence can support. The Eromanga Sea has disappeared. Its currents no longer move across northern Queensland, and the animals that once occupied its waters have passed beyond any living witness. Yet traces of that vanished world remain embedded in rock, stored in collections, measured by instruments, and interpreted by people who were separated from it by an immense stretch of geological time. This is why finding Kronosaurus matters, not because the past can be restored exactly as it was, but because something real crossed that enormous distance. A living animal became a fossil. A fossil became an object of study. An object of study became evidence. Evidence became knowledge. 115 million years ago, Kronosaurus moved through a sea that had no memory of the future. Today, a fragment of that animal can sit in a museum, and through careful observation, its existence can become part of human knowledge. The sea is gone. The predator is gone. But the stone remained long enough for someone to learn how to read it.